Now, in the gospel this evening, before we see how it applies to ourselves, we need to fill in a little bit of the background to the gospel, and you'll see how that is very important. If you're going to understand any idea what is in the gospel this evening and how to apply it to ourselves, you may be surprised what we can get out of the reading here in the Gospel of Matthew. We're told at that time Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. You might ask, where exactly were Tyre and Sidon? They were about 25 miles north of Galilee. There were two coastal towns and in a place called Lebanon. And that will be a name very familiar to all of us this evening, unfortunately for the wrong reasons, because of what happened there a couple of weeks ago with that terrible explosion and fire that killed so many people and destroyed so much property and so many people's homes. And then we hear about this Canaanite woman. What exactly, where did she come from? Well, she would have been part of the Syro-Phoenician race, and very much somebody whom the Jews would have no time for, not just because she was a woman, but because she was Canaanite. And then a very important thing to try and explain is what Jesus says to the woman in the gospel this evening probably brings up a lot of questions in people's minds, because it's not what we would expect of Jesus. So how come these words are said, or what is written down here as being said by Jesus? And so we got to remember that the Gospel of Matthew was written sometime about 40 years after the time of Jesus. And Matthew, as was Mark, because Mark had this story in the Gospel too, they were writing the Gospel for the community of their time. And there was a lot of division between the Jewish converts and the Gentile converts. And so they kind of, well, there could be two reasons. They put these words into the mouth of Jesus, or Jesus would have known how they were thinking, that they had no time for the Canaanites. Also, very, very interesting is, now we go back to the beginning of the Gospel, Tyre and Sidon. So she was a border woman. So this Gospel this evening spans the centuries, from the first century in Palestine right up to the Rio Grande Valley, to the 21st century, to the Mexican borders, so to speak. And it brings up the whole question of, how do we treat foreigners? How do we treat foreigners? Now, another interesting little part in the Gospel, which I forgot to share with you, is she was a woman who was audacious, courageous, and a woman who persevered. She wasn't going to give up easily. And we all know women like that nowadays. Women who, in spite of difficulties, in spite of their race or their color, are not going to be put down. More power to them. What about the phrase Jesus used in the Gospel this evening, it looks like a bit of banter between the Canaanite woman and Jesus. Well, another interesting thing there is that Jesus said, well, it's not right to give the food of the children to dogs. Now, dogs was a slur word by the Jews, especially in reference to the Canaanites, or to any non-Jew, in fact, to the Gentiles. But this woman was quite smart, because she latched on or caught the word that Jesus used for a dog. He didn't use the normal Greek word, which is koan. And the Jews had no time for dogs because they regarded them as unclean, and they would eat anything, including pork. I quite like pork, but I mean, that's okay nowadays. But the word that Jesus used for dog was kononois, which was a household pet. And she latched on to that. And she came back at Jesus and she said, well, you know, a household pet is part of the family, and they often get little bits of food from the master's table, which in fact, as you know, is very, very true. You probably do the same thing yourself nowadays. And so then, we come to the question in the gospel this evening. How does that gospel this evening apply to me now that you know what it's about? It's about prejudice and about racism. Maybe you never thought of that before when we read this particular part of the gospel about the Canaanite woman, but it's very much about race and color, race and color and prejudice. And again, look at the similarities. Here's a woman pleading for her child, pleading for her daughter to be cured. Look at all the mothers at the border whose children were taken away from them, and they don't know where they are, and some of them will never see them again. And they thought they were coming to begin a better life. They were fleeing from war and from hunger and from danger. So, where are we in all this? Where am I? Where are you? Do I think that I'm prejudiced, that I'm racist? Well, I'd like to think that I wasn't, but you have to look a bit deeper than that. You've got to look in, I've got to look into my soul, and so have you. So I say to you this evening, are you in any way racist or prejudiced? Only you can answer that. It would seem that a lot of people at the moment in this country are very prejudiced. And it's bordering also on racism at times. It's a fact that we cannot get away from. And maybe we sit back and say, I'm not like them. Well, you know, can you honestly say that from your heart? We're in the middle of a presidential election at the moment, and look at how bitter are things and the horrible things we hear being said and being written. We got a good example of that this week, when a woman of color was chosen to run for the vice presidency. She was absolutely denigrated, lashed in the media by certain parts by certain politicians. Is that how we ought to treat people. Is that what an election is all about? Is it not about casting your vote for the best person, for whom you might think do the best job? It's not about, I always think, what party you belong to, but it's about our country, your country. Who can do the best at the moment? Who would you really want to be in charge? We're going through a terrible time. We're going through a pandemic. We're going through one of the highest rates of unemployment. Many people this evening out there are worried, are depressed, are wondering, how can I survive? How can I survive? Nobody knows what the future holds. We can only live one day at a time. We need help. We need guidance at the moment. And that doesn't seem to be available. And all this comes in to the gospel tonight: prejudice and racism. And so I want you to seriously think about that, but not about just what's going on out there, but what's going on in here. And if you happen to have Netflix, or you have access to Netflix, I'd encourage you to look at a very even-handed documentary on Netflix. It's called Immigration Country, or Immigration Nation. You'll find it on Netflix, and it's a very even-handed documentary about what's going on at the borders. It's not easy to watch, and it's painful. It's not something I think one can particularly enjoy. But it does bring up the whole question of, is that what we're into? Is that what we're supposed to be at? Building walls of separation among people. What about you and I in our lives? How often we build, if not materially, in our own way of thinking, in our own mind, we build walls of separation. There are certain people who are not, so to speak, in our group. They're outsiders. How do we deal with outsiders? How do we deal with people who we consider not belong to our group? That's an important question. So all of us, and I very much include myself, we all need to look at our own lives, look at our own conscience, and really ask ourselves at this time, I think, especially in what is happening here in the country, we need to ask each and every one of us some very serious questions.